All right.
All right, here we are. This is the first edition of our highly expected AACE Connection, which is a new program hosted by AACE Brazil, whose objective is to take international experts, authorities, authors, and managers to the Brazilian community. We want to extend our reach to be an AAC Brazil section, but not just within Brazil, but to be a Brazilian section with an international approach. And this is the only section at AAC that has an international director, Mr. Felipe Gutierrez, who will conduct this meeting. I would like to welcome Anthony Gonzales. Hello, Anthony.
Hello, Aldo. Boa tarde.
Boa tarde. How are you?
I'm
And
doing well. How are
I
you?
would like
Good
to
to see
say that
you.
it's a pleasure for AAC Brazil section to have you as our first interviewee. And we all know that you are very active. You are a very well-known consultant in U.S. And you are also the chair of the subcommittee of claims and disputes at AAC. So I will not take more time in this introduction. I would like then our international director, Felipe Gutierrez, to take on the show. And Felipe will be the host on behalf of AAC Board of Directors. Felipe, please welcome Anthony again, and it's with you.
All right. Thank you very much, Aldo. Thank you very much, Anthony, again for being here. Thank you very much, the audience. We have had really exciting numbers of people interested in this program, which I'm sure is going to be fun. So the idea is that we have an informative program, as Aldo was explaining, where we can share experiences and best practice from all over the world with the Brazilian community and at large the Latin American and other communities. Really, we can, because nowadays everything is online, so we can do this very globalized kind of opportunity for people to see what's being done in other places. And there's going to be a little bit of improvisation as well, because it's the first one. So we're trying to figure out what's the best format. So please be patient with us if there are any hiccups that might happen. And with no further ado, as Aldo said, so we welcome Anthony Gonzales. Thank you very much for taking the challenge of being here almost on the first attempt. So that I'm sure it's going to be fun and informative, as I said. So thank you for taking the time and the opportunity to share what you've seen, what you're doing, what you see that's done in the US when it comes to quantifying damages related to delays and extension of time. And also put into context how you use the recommended practice 29R-03 in that situation. So we have had some feedback from the audience, from the Brazilian community, and some from the people that are members and just interested professionals in the industry around the region. And we came up, based on that, we came up with mostly generic questions. So I want you to take the opportunity to just share with us your experiences in using the recommended practice. How good does it do to have a practice like that that tells us, for this kind of situation, that's what you do. For this other kind of situation, that's something else. I know it's something in use for a long time in the US, and is widely used. So in Latin America, it's newer, I would say. So people are very interested to know, so how does it do any good having that practice? Well, how is it actually used, right? So that'll be really awesome to hear your thoughts on it. And then also based on what Aldo mentioned in terms of your position with the ACE, if you want to give us a little bit of an update on what's being updated, on what's new with or what's being revised in the current practice, recommended practice, that'll be awesome. So you have around 30 minutes to take the floor, and I understand you have some slides, so go through them and do as you wish. And we are gonna have at the end, just to make it easier, number of questions and answers. So there's gonna be an opportunity as well for the audience to make questions. And I was going to say, if the audience can understand and for any reason they don't feel comfortable asking in English, feel free to ask in Portuguese through either the Zoom or the YouTube channel. We'll be happy to translate those to Anthony, and then you'll get the recorded answers. So the video is being recorded. So that's also another disclaimer we have to do. So this is going to be made available to the ACE members of Brazil, and perhaps to some other people as well. I'm not sure yet, but if anybody has any issues with that, please let us know straight away. Other than that, it's all yours, Anthony. Thank you again, welcome, and the show is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Felipe, for the opportunity. And of course, Aldo, as always, I'm excited to be here. Obviously, AACE is near and dear to my heart, interest, and obviously one of the many passions that I have, in the industry. And so I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to join my Brazilian friends. And I've spent many weeks on end in Brazil, and I have many fond memories and friends that are from the country. So thank you for this opportunity. And so I thought what would be helpful to the group would be to just do a quick overview of a couple things that you've touched on before we get to kind of a Q&A. And in that process, as Aldo has mentioned, a little bit of my background. I currently serve as the chair of the CDR subcommittee for AACE International. So the CDR, which stands for Claims and Dispute Resolution Subcommittee, and the level of responsibility that myself and the subcommittee members have is the general oversight of the RPs that are coming out as it involves the claims and dispute resolution, best practices, recommended practices, guides that we think are going to advance the industry. And so one of my many tasks is to talk about what the RP is, what it's not, as far as 29R is. And then in addition to that, what are the next steps? How is it going to evolve? How do we take what has been very graciously developed over many years, and how do we take and expand that to where we can get a larger adoption to where we're currently at, so where more people can understand. But where I currently sit is not kind of what got me here, and I've been passionate about project controls for over 20 years. And so starting in the early 2000s, doing it both proactively and forensically, serving as a testifying expert since 2006, I have continuously used and referred to the AACE model as well as others to understand both what needs to be done on a given case and also evaluating other alternatives that may be put forth from opposing sides. So a few things here. So let's go into a couple things I did want to cover. So the RP29, I'll do a brief overview of that, and I know we're limited on time, so I do want to get to the question and answers, but I'll talk briefly about the next steps as it relates specifically to the RP. Because I think that would be a good audience. And if there are questions along the way, Felipe or Aldo, or that come up in the chat, I'd be happy to address those, as we move forward. So let's do a quick overview of what the RP is. I'm sure everybody's had a chance to review it. Everybody's at least somewhat familiar with it. It's funny, I teach at the University of Texas at Austin. I teach a course in project controls in the Graduate School of Civil Engineering. And this is one of the many documents that I have my students read. And my comment to them is I assign it to them pretty much a couple of days in advance of the course. And my comment the very first day or the next day of class is, now, how many people have read it and memorized it and understand it? Now, I'm fortunate enough to where the students are certainly well-versed. There's maybe some PhD candidates, but obviously there's a lot of complex, things that go in there. And so the RP, what it generally does is it provides a guide for an analyst to understand how to go about identifying, quantifying delay, and the different forms of substantiation or the different forms of approaches that one can take in doing so. And so it's broken down into various different segments of what is commonly referred to as taxonomy, identifying the different concepts or methods of implementation that have been aggregated in the document. And so before we get to that stage, the key thing for the audience to understand is what is a time impact? What is the purpose of the document as a whole? And when we're looking at a time impact, it's typically a comparison between what's been planned versus what actually happened on a given project. And so we all know in the world that we live in construction, that impacts or delays could occur at any given time. And so the idea here is, how do we go about identifying those time impacts? How do we go about quantifying them? And how do we understand the root cause or causal events that led to those? And so when we're looking at schedule delays, they're really, two types. You've got late start, you've got extended durations. And there's a lot of questions that come up with the types of delay events and how to go about identifying them. The use of software these days makes it very easy for an analyst to understand how proactively a schedule is prepared, the associated early dates, the late dates, the total float values that are being reflected in the schedule itself. And so to go through and identify and quantify delay, you really have to look at activities that are along the critical path, or sometimes referred to as the longest path. The longest path of a project is the longest continuous chain of activities that, in effect, establish the overall substantial completion of the project. And as a result, any time impacts along the longest path is going to extend out the substantial completion date. And so that's what we're really talking about here is how do we go about and identifying and quantifying those impacts, and what are the different methods that could exist so that way we can capture, is there a late start, is there an extended duration? But at the same time, and this is clear in the RP, an analyst has to not only look at the amount of delays, but also any gains that are afforded in the schedule as well. And a gain can certainly be an early start or an early completion of a duration. So those are the things that are accounted for in the RP, and then those are some of the things that play into the analysis. One of the common concepts that often comes up is what is the difference between delay and disruption? And so in looking at that, as I mentioned, a delay is in essence, or very simply put, a time impact to an activity that's on the longest path, and thus postpones the substantial completion. Whereas a disruption may very well be a time impact, meaning an extended duration, but it's to an activity that is not on the critical path, or excuse me, longest path. But it still is considered a time impact. And so it's interesting to note that a disruption does not necessarily lead to a delay, but it can. If the disruption is prolonged enough, it can eventually impact activities on the critical path, resulting in delay. And so there are a number of different scenarios that would play out as to why a disruption would occur that may be different than the delays that are observed along the longest path. The other concept that's touched on in the RP is different concepts. There's excusable delay, non-excusable delay, and then the concept of compensability. And so, excusable delays are those delays that are not the responsibility of the contractor. And so that would mean that it's maybe, depending upon the type of contract, the responsibility of an owner or designer, but it's someone, not the contractor or subcontractor in question. And then you have the issue of determining whether or not a delay is compensable or non-compensable, meaning is there any monetary damages or money damages associated with that delay. And then you have the concept of non-excusable delays. So that is, simply put, any time impact or delay that is attributable to the contractor's actions or inaction. So that means it is the fault of the contractor. Obviously that could be sequencing, manpower, a number of different issues, material delivery if it's their responsibility. That could certainly lead to delay. And in this regard, you still have the issue of compensable. And when you're talking about non-excusable delays, you're looking at whether or not it's compensable in the form of liquidated damages that could be asserted against a general contractor. And so that may be a situation depending upon the contract. And then you have what often leads to a lot of, I would say, disconnect between experts that are evaluating those delays. There's an issue of concurrency that comes up, and concurrent delay, simply put, is two or more activities that are either of which would delay the project that may occur at the same time or within the same time period. And that's important to note because, in the RP, that's one of the things that, kind of an advance notice, one of the things that we're touching on and having discussions around about how to further define that across the different MIPs that are currently represented in the RP. And so concurrent delay is a very interesting topic for us, and it's an interesting topic for the industry because it's often where opposing experts may differ from their perspective. And there's different scenarios that play out, whether one delay is excusable, another delay is excusable, does that equal an excusable delay, and so forth. And we can go around about how that plays with both the compensability and the non-compensable space. The RP, in its current form, outlines what those scenarios could look like. And very simply put, as I mentioned, a concurrent delay is where two delays occurred, either of which may delay the overall substantial completion of the project. And so if you do have two delays, one delay may be the responsibility of the owner, whereas the other responsibility for the concurrent delay may be the owner or another party, or more importantly, a force majeure event. And so the RP in its current form talks about what that means to an analyst and how to review in the event that two delayed events are occurring simultaneously. It's up to the analyst to determine that level of responsibility through the causation analysis, and in order to determine, is it compensable or is it not compensable? And so there's kind of three components there. Is it an owner-caused delay? Is it a contractor-caused delay? Or is it a force majeure event, which, in other words, is an act of God weather event, or in some regards, some would say the current situation with COVID. So those are all things that play out that the RP, addresses in its current form. Now, I'm going to pause on this slide because basically, prior to the RP's development, there were some commonly used terminologies, and these terminologies are still used today. There are several different methods that have been recognized prior to the production of the RP and that are still used in this regard. I'll go through a couple of them, and I'm going to exclude one. And the reason why I highlight that is because it is not a recognized methodology. So one of these up here is not a recognized methodology in any way, shape, or form. And so that the recognized methodologies would be impacted as planned, collapsed as built, the as planned versus as built, the time impact analysis, and windows analysis, also commonly referred to as a period, contemporaneous period analysis. And the reason why I even mentioned the total or modified time is because I see it so frequently. But that is not a recognized methodology that should be used or deployed by any analyst. And so even in my class, my teaching, I identify what it is, but I also, the only reason why I do that is because it is not a recognized methodology that should be used. And that simply is just taking the adjusted contract substantial completion date minus what the actual substantial completion date is. And that delta is the delay that would be apportioned to a respective party, most often the contractor. So that is not a recognized methodology that should be used. And the reason being is because it doesn't rely upon the critical path, take into account the actions or inactions of the parties as a whole, and as well as does not take any specifically ownership from the owner's perspective. So, and there are some methodologies that are preferred, some are dependent on several different factors. Now, in the production of the RP, in recognition of a lot of these different methods, what the RP currently does is it provides a primer between what historically has been a recognition of delay analysis methods to a more refined position of what that is. And so if we look at what the RP in its current form looks like, it breaks it into several different MIPs that talk about the different methods that could be deployed. And so here is a snapshot of what the current RP depicts, and it breaks it down into really two different concepts. The first is observational, meaning I'm not making any adjustments. I'm only observing what is, contemporaneously prepared during the course of the project. And there's a couple caveats to that, but that's generally, the concept. And that could play out with both static logic, meaning there are no adjustments, or dynamic logic, and looking at it on a period by period basis and so forth, versus the modeled, where there are adjustments that are being made under certain circumstances. And the RP does a pretty good job of outlining some guidelines around that. And so when we're looking at this, what this table does is it provides a primer between the previous list of activities or methods in comparison to what the taxonomy is under the RP. So 3.1, is also referred to as an as-planned versus as-built. 3.2 can commonly refer to as a windows analysis. The use of dynamic logic, meaning you're looking at it on a contemporaneous update basis, is also referred to in some regards as sometimes as a time impact analysis, or if it's grouped, also looked at as a windows analysis. Very similar vernacular than what was used or represented before. And so what this does is it takes an advancement of what the industry had been doing and takes it one step further to provide a framework around the different methodologies that could exist. And ultimately listing out 9 different methodologies that one can look upon to determine how to analyze a project. Now, some experts probably use an MIP more frequently than others, while others may take a different approach. The preferred approach that I like to take is evaluate each of the methods and overlay them with the facts that are being presented in the course of the project. As we know in our profession, not every construction project is managed the same, is handled the same, or has the same issues or the same level of information for which an expert can rely upon. And so that's why an overlay of what the data or the facts are in relation to what are the recognized methodologies that one could rely upon is going to be important for that. And so the selection of the methodology is going to be, looking at several different factors. One is, first and foremost, what's in the contract. The contract often stipulates whether or not a specific method has to be done. And what we're seeing in the industry, specifically with some of the larger DOT programs around the United States, you're seeing specific requirements in the specifications that require the use of a methodology in the RP or a specific methodology within the RP. And so that's exciting to see because we've seen some traction in many different fronts. And when you're starting to have parties include that in the specifications, then it's an exciting endeavor to see because you're starting to have that not just accepted, but have it be the standard across the board. And so the other thing is the purpose of the analysis. Is it the purposes of a mediation? Is it for the purposes of a settlement discussion? Is it for the purposes of an arbitration? Is it in the United States? Is it in federal court and so forth? We also look at the source that's available, the data that's available. The quality of the schedules often come into play, and that's where the RP addresses some of those issues, because one of the important things is, as an analyst, is to look and evaluate the reasonableness of the schedules as they were contemporaneously produced. The size of the dispute, some of the methods require more time than others, and as a result, as many clients are, may be resource or capital constrained. And so there's a need for the analyst to make sure that the method of analysis matches up with the size and, of course, the resource constraints that the client may have. The complexity of the dispute, is it necessary for an analyst to look at every single schedule in detail and provide an expert opinion on each one, or can certain schedules be grouped? So that could be, as I mentioned before, the budget, the time allowed, and then, of course, the expertise of the individual. I've certainly been across many experts who use the same method, and certainly there's some advantages and disadvantages to that. But the idea here as experts is to become more familiar with every possibility, not necessarily for the need to perform that, but also for the need to understand and be aware of what the opposing expert is saying and the recognition of that methodology, so that way one can compare apples to apples across the board. And then, of course, the forum for resolution and so on. So there are some general principles that the RP talks about, and those general principles are, first and foremost, that the schedules are based off the CPM calculations. And a lot of that is driven because in the United States, to prove and substantiate and to identify and quantify delay, the impact has to occur along the longest path, or commonly referred to as well as a critical path. And so that's a major tenet. The other one is the data that must be used. And so looking at what is the associated data date, what is the software that's being used, what is the reliability of the information that's being housed within the schedule. It also talks about the shared ownership of float within a network, and sometimes the contract doesn't refer to that, but how is the float calculated? What is the contractual language is included? The other thing is update float. Is it preferred over baseline float? They also talks about the subnetwork of the float value. So the concept of float is ever more important to the analyst, because in the event that the float calculations are incorrect, that could lead to incorrect calculations on the delay side. And so it goes through those general principles. So at a high level, I just wanted to summarize a couple concepts here for the audience: time impact, as well as the taxonomy for the RP. I'll briefly touch on a couple of the next steps, because I think that's going to be important. Specifically, assuming that most people have read the RP in detail, there's some exciting things that are coming down the pipeline that we're working on right now. The first is what I'm referring to it internally. This is not an official term, but I'm referring to it as the next version or the next iteration of the RP. And what that's going to do is it's going to enhance and simplify the RP. Currently, in its present form, the RP, while covering a lot of material, there's a lot of complexity within there that is often either not understood by some parties or is hard to understand. And only having done something many times can an expert start to understand the intent or the description or the activities or the description of how to perform a given methodology. And so the current RP, as I mentioned, has 9 MIPs, or minimum implementation protocols. So describing the 9 different methods. And so what we're doing is that we're breaking up additional recommended practices into what's referred to as subsidiary recommended practices. So having them broken up essentially into smaller deliverables for the intended audience to make sure that they can understand each one a little bit more effectively, and enhance and elaborate on some of the concepts that are covered in there. The current RP, in its current draft, its current form, would still serve as kind of the master recommended practice. So there's going to be a lot of references back to the original document. So it's not a complete new version that's going on, but it's more the enhancement of it. And it'll contain some summary descriptions that you'll see some similarities between the 2 corresponding documents. The other is that, we're going to be looking to group them together according to the MIPs as they currently exist. So 3.1 and 3.2 are grouped, 3.3 and 3.4 and 5 are grouped, 3.6 and 3.7, 3.8 and 3.9. And so, for example, myself, I'm leading the group on specifically 3.3. And so we've kind of have a draft of that listed out. And what we're doing is referencing all of the technical papers that have been authored through the course of the last decade as it relates to those given MIPs, and incorporating some of those concepts into this next version. So it's more of a holistic view of this. And so if you had a side-by-side comparison between the master or recommended practices that currently sits to subsidiary, you're going to see that some of the common vernacular between the 2 sets of documents, or now it's going to be really forward comparison to the 1. The other thing to note is that the current RP in its form right now is what we would refer to as will require someone with advanced skills to really understand and effectively implement. Our goal is with this next iteration is to have individuals with more intermediate to advanced level skills to do that. And that's so that way it's more widely understood and it's easier to follow in its more simplistic form. So there are a couple different factors that are being considered in this, that kind of go into the evaluation of the implementation. And so the idea here is not to evaluate the method, meaning not to criticize necessarily a given method, but to evaluate the implementation of that method. because oftentimes that's where experts tend to differ across the board. The guide is to the implementation, how it should be implemented, not necessarily the undermining the methodology itself. And so that's important to note, because oftentimes I'm sitting across an opposing expert who may use a different method. And so not only do I have to understand the method that that other expert is using, but I also have to understand how that method was implemented. And that is, in essence, my focus of, reviewing or evaluating any opposing experts' opinions and findings. Not necessarily whether or not they did an MIP 3.3 or an MIP 3.5 and whether or not that is necessarily justified, but how they went about implementing and reaching those conclusions. So I'm going to stop here. I'm about the time that I think you've afforded me so far, Felipe, and hopefully there's some questions, but there's a lot more that can be done. I know a lot of my predecessors have done a very extensive discussions on this, but I wanted to make sure it's more of a free-flowing Q&A, and hopefully the overview provided some insight on what's to come.
Yeah, excellent, Anthony. Thank you so much. That was great. Yeah, we did have some questions coming through. I'd like to share some of those with you, and then perhaps we can take it from there. One of them has to do is very, it's a very popular topic right now. Yeah,
just one second. Anthony, could you stop sharing the screen so that we can see you?
Yes.
Oh, good point. On YouTube, right?
Wait, let me see. Bear with me.
That's great.
There
Thanks.
we go.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask something that is very, and it's very specific on I guess, on current experience, very current matters. So people are asking how delays are being treated given the coronavirus impact, the pandemic impacts on construction projects. I guess the question, and perhaps if you can say something about how the recommended practice helps or not, or is being actually used nowadays. I mean, such a new subject. People like to hear more about that. If you can share some of your experience, what you've seen.
Sure, absolutely. It's one of the more common questions that not only do we get from our fellow colleagues, but also from our clients. And obviously, the COVID situation's impacted everybody in construction projects across the world. And in the United States, construction has been identified as a, quote, essential workforce. So most construction projects have continued. Now, there's some pockets within the United States where construction has stopped. So the RP has served. The RP has served in a number of different capacities as it relates to this. So if we're looking at COVID, when COVID first occurred, the idea is how does one go about and model the associated impacts given the level of uncertainty that's going on within my job site, my location, and on top of that, how do I maintain a safe work environment while still being able to move forward in construction? Now, again, some markets did not have that capability. In Boston, New York, job sites were shut down. And so, how does one go through and model that level of uncertainty? Well, it's no different than if you're looking at the creation of a time impact analysis. My colleagues actually recently produced a paper on how to go through and model out those COVID-related impacts in the schedules through the creation of fragnets. Now, another RP that is published through Aace, 52, RP 52 it talks about the time impact analysis, how it's done, and how to go about doing that. And often that was a tool for our clients and for us to use in the initial stages of COVID. And the thought was that if the job site is shut down, well, hopefully there's an end in sight to where they can pick things back up. But until it does conclude, the best that you can do is anticipate how much time you would have. And the challenge with that is not only does the safety protocols from the contractor have to be taken into consideration, but that of the owner, that of the local jurisdiction, and that of the state, and then of course within the United States itself. So there's a lot of different factors that go into it. Oh, not to mention the CDC, or the Center for Disease Control in the United States, because a lot of those best practices are those in which contractors adhere to along others as well. And so modeling out in initial stages is through the use of the creation of fragnets or time impact analysis to try to understand what that could do to the substantial completion date. And the idea is to communicate that to the owner as best as possible. Now, let's fast forward a little bit, several months after the pandemic had taken place. The question that often comes up is, how do we model forensically the impacts that have occurred to the project as it relates to COVID? Now, that's going to be in really two different forms. The first of which is, and I'll get to the monetary component here in a minute, but the first of which is delay. How much delay occurred on the job? Was the job shut down? Or what activities, because of COVID, required additional time to perform because I had to social distance, or I had to do additional precautionary measures to keep my team and my workforce safe. The second type of impacts that materialize are those activities that are not on the critical or longest path. And the form in which you're going to see these things occur is through extended durations. And so in the event that you're seeing extended durations, you're going to start to find evidence and start to question whether or not the planned performance of that activity was extended in the actual performance due to the additional precautionary measures that were required due to COVID. And so what the RP does is it allows the forensic analyst to quantify the delay on the job, but it's through the causation analysis that the analyst truly needs to understand whether or not that extension of time is due to COVID. Now, there are other types of delays that would exist as it relates to COVID, and that obviously the supply chain impacts have certainly devastated some projects. So getting material out to the job due to the inability to freight or ship, the goods to the site, you'll start to see perhaps some late starts and so forth. So what the RP does is it allows the ability to use a method to quantify delay, but it's a causation analysis that one would need to do to tie back to COVID. And oftentimes it's a review of the contract in terms of whether or not those are compensable damages, or whether or not those are force majeure events, which would only afford a contractor time but no money.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Good. And just because we wanted to make it shorter than an hour, it might not be possible, but I did have another question. There are many questions, but I did have another one that I thought was interesting. We saw some people participating here today from all over the place. We have people from the Middle East, from Europe, from Latin America, the US, so very wide representation. And as you might know, and I'm sure you know, but there's the delay protocol of the Society of Construction Law in the UK is widely used in many places. I don't think it's very, very used in the US. So some people were asking, what are the differences And perhaps if you don't want to go there, you might just comment, how much people talk about it in the US, because I understand that the RP is very well implemented and used like widely. It's very widely accepted as well, so people know what it is and they just go to it. But please share with us your thoughts.
Absolutely. Good question. And I guess a point of correction, I would say the SCL protocol is certainly not as frequently used, but you're starting to see some traction in certain pockets with that. And there are certain members that are also AAC authors of the RP that are also instrumental in bringing some of that dialogue into the United States. So you are starting to see some chapters that talk about the SCL protocol. And so the key here, I think, just like any analyst, is to be aware of the different types of methodologies that are available to an analyst and understand those differences and similarities. And I will say, comparison to the SCL with the RP, there were a lot more variances in the very first iteration of the SCL protocol than there was in the updated version that took place. I think it was a couple of years ago that was released. And there are a lot of things that were kind of, brought more similarly to the AACE methods. The issues of float, the issues of concurrency are more in line with where the recommended practice is. But there are some subtle differences that exist between the two. However, that being said, in an expert capacity, I have not seen the SCL protocol used in jurisdictions within the United States. Where I have seen the SCL protocol is where perhaps through ICC arbitration in certain markets, in Europe, Middle East, and even North Africa, where the SCL protocol is used much more frequently than the RP is. And that's certainly understandable from that perspective.
Okay, thank you. And just because of time, I guess we just go for one more question, unless Aldo tells us we have more time.
No, we can have 5 more minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent.
So,
and I'll be brief for each one.
Yeah, well, I have this one question that I think is not from me, it's from the audience, that I think you'll not have time to answer, but they want to hear more about concurrent delay. They're looking to understand it a little bit better, and perhaps how it is understood and accepted or dealt with within the US.
Yeah, so the issue of thank you, Felipe. So the issue of concurrency is certainly one that's of interest to experts in the U.S., and it's often the one that is most heatedly debated. And the reason being is because the RP in its current definition talks about the issue of two concurrent delays that are occurring at the same time or within the same time period. And from the RP perspective, looking at this as an analyst, and I can only speak for myself, the issue comes in the same time period. And when you're talking about the same time period, is it the time period in which, for example, if you're doing an MIP 3.3, is it the concurrency within that period of time, meaning that window, or is it have to overlap on a day-for-day basis? And so the RP doesn't elaborate on that as a concept, and that's something that's being discussed, but it's really for the experts to talk about and discuss in an open forum. And so when we're looking at concurrency, the owner's perspective typically is, if I can establish that, yes, if I'm delaying the project, but if I can establish that even if I had provided that material, or even if I had, provided the design on time, the contractor wasn't ready for that, and therefore there's an issue of concurrency. And the question really becomes, what is the associated impact, and what is the basis of the delay for each one? And is there an overlap in the time, or is there an overlap in the amount of impact that could occur? And so looking at it granularly, you'd want to look at on a day-for-day basis, is there any level of concurrency at the same time? Or is there any level of concurrency in the same time period? Meaning, is the impact of those two events impacting the critical path or substantial completion the same amount of time at the same time, either of which occurring would have delayed the project. That is one thing. The other thing is, I think one aspect that is somewhat controversial that I've even ran into is the previous chart that I showed about an owner delay, a contractor delay, and the issue of compensability and so forth. And so getting over the hurdle of an owner delay and an establishing substantiation for a contractor delay, the next issue is, well, if they're happening at the same time, why wouldn't you just be given, time but no money? And if you think about the potential outcomes, and I say potential outcomes, it really bears on the trier of fact to make the determination, not only in whether or not they've accepted the label of an owner delay or contractor delay, but also if they've accepted the potential outcome of what that may look like in the form of compensability. And then throw in more complicated things with force majeure. So what happens in the event where you have an owner-caused delay and you have inclement weather or you have a hurricane event that's going on at the same time? What remedy does a contractor have to be able to recover the delay damages? Because if the owner-caused delay happened first and then the force majeure event happened, shortly thereafter, either of which would have delayed the project, then in that situation, it's going to be a combination of both. Because if you have the owner-caused delay starting first, there's going to be some form of compensability through extended general conditions. But as soon as that force majeure event starts to occur, either of that event or the owner-caused delay would have delayed the overall project. However, force majeure, unless the contract says otherwise, is typically affords the contractor time but no money. And so under that premise, that's when you start transitioning from compensable to non-compensable over that period of time. And so I think the big issue and most of the debates that I get into is, as I mentioned, the latter half of that definition from the RP, which is, the two delays occurring at the same time in the same time period. That's probably the more contentious one. So hopefully that sheds some light on that, and I can spend probably a whole hour in debating the pros and cons about the same time period and what does that really mean.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, it was the time we had for today. It was a great fun having you, very informative. Again, thank you for taking the first, the risk of being the first one on this program that's been sponsored by Aldo and the ACE Brazil. So it's a great program that I'm very, very happy and proud to be part of. So thank you for this. And Aldo, I'll let you close the program and the event for today.
Yes, Anthony, I would like to thank you very much for giving us this very valuable lecture on the RP29, which is one of the most known recommended practices of AACE. But I would like a final word from you for our audience. Is it worth to be a member of AACE?
Absolutely, 100%. The organization has done so much for me as a professional and for me as a person. Not only has it afforded me some great relationships and friendships, but it's also allowed me to be a part of taking the industry to that next level. And so what I would do is to encourage everyone on the audience that if you want to have an impact on the built environment, and you want to do so in a manner that advances the profession of project controls, the best way to do that really is through AACE. And my passion has always been forensics, because I like looking at, in the United States, it's the CSI of construction, right? So it's the forensics, the evaluation, what happened, and taking some of those lessons learned and applying them in the proactive side. So from the colleagues that I've met across the world, and the passion that each and one of those members has, is very infectious and exciting to see. And when we get back to a more a normal time, getting face-to-face time with each and every colleague is extremely valuable and exciting. And even I'll have a small plug for the CDR subcommittee. We are looking for participants. If you have an interest in the next evolution of the RP, if you have an interest in the CDR track, if you have an interest in anything related to the claims and dispute resolution, please reach out to me directly, and I'd be happy to see where we can get you involved, because this really is a member-led organization from the subcommittee's perspective, and so we encourage and as much participation as possible. So I welcome new members, and I welcome members to the subcommittee that I'm currently chairing.
I'm delighted to hear that from you, and I would like to tell everybody who is watching this webinar, this part of AACE Brazil Connection, that become a member of AACE, and you will see the value of being part of this excellent association of cost engineering practitioners. Thanks again, Anthony Gonzales. Thank Felipe Gutierrez, and I see you all. We see you all in the next edition of AACE Brazil Section Connection.